April 2024. Evening, Wirral, Merseyside. Behind the door of a quiet suburban home, trust was shattered in the most unthinkable way. A carer, once welcomed, turned predator against the vulnerable woman she served. Jane Hill, once a grandmother and devoted partner, now a convicted killer serving life. How could a woman tasked with protecting the elderly cross into such betrayal? This was not theft driven by desperation alone, but an act rooted in fear of exposure, silenced by violence. She lingered for hours in her victim's home, returning at dawn, pretending nothing had happened. Inside, female killers of Merseyside vertical bar from Liverpool to Wirral, full stories and sentences. Welcome to UK Real Crime, where Merseyside streets whisper their darkest secrets and its most dangerous women are finally unmasked. Today, we trace the shocking cases of female killers across Merseyside, from Liverpool to Wirral, uncovering the betrayals, the brutality, and the justice that followed. What you're about to hear may stay with you forever. First offender, Jane Hill, 52 years old. Merseyside, April 2024. In a quiet residential street in Wirral, trust turned fatally into betrayal. A carer, once welcomed into the home of a vulnerable woman, crossed an unthinkable line. The perpetrator was Jane Hill, sometimes reported as Jane Hill, a 51-year-old grandmother from Norwich Drive in Upton. She had no previous convictions and had built a life around her family and long-term partner. Her job as a carer demanded compassion, reliability, and above all, trust. Among her clients was 90-year-old Marie Thompson, a retired physicist suffering from Parkinson's disease, frailty, and memory loss. Earlier in April, suspicions of missing money from Mrs. Thompson's handbag led to a hidden camera being installed by her neighbors. The footage was damning. Hill was caught taking cash. She was suspended from her job, but the consequences of exposure drove her into darker territory. 4 days before the killing, she went to Mrs. Thompson's house, intending to return the money but lost her nerve. On the night of April 22, Hill's actions revealed planning. She left her home around 8:30 p.m., parked nearby, and waited until the lights in her client's bedroom were off. Using the key from the secure box outside, she let herself in, hoping to confront or silence Mrs. Thompson. When the elderly woman shouted, Hill panicked. She struck her over the head with a metal flask. When the cries did not stop, she pressed a pillow down until all movement ceased. Phone data later confirmed Hill stayed in the property for hours before returning home at dawn, pretending she had been on a night shift. The following morning, another carer found Mrs. Thompson lifeless. The post-mortem revealed blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. Detectives quickly identified Hill as a suspect. Initially, she denied involvement, but evidence mounted. On the third police interview, confronted with mobile data, she confessed. At Liverpool Crown Court in October 2024, Hill admitted murder and 4 counts of theft. The prosecutor argued she killed to remove a witness to her dishonesty. Judge Andrew Menery KC described the killing as a gross breach of trust, marked by premeditation and persistence against a defenseless elderly woman in her own home. Hill was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22.5 years. In the courtroom, Hill stood pale, her head bowed, offering little emotion as the sentence was delivered. For the victim's family, grief was joined by shock at the brutality of someone entrusted to provide care. Myra's niece, Anne Charters, said they could only imagine the terror she experienced during her final moments. A close friend admitted losing all confidence in humanity itself. This case resonated far beyond Merseyside, highlighting the vulnerability of elderly people dependent on professional carers and the devastating impact of a single betrayal. The lessons are stark. Always ensure vulnerable relatives are protected by checks and accountability in care arrangements. Trust your instincts when small irregularities, like missing money, appear, and remember that silence or hesitation in reporting concerns can enable further harm. Vigilance is not mistrust, it is protection. Ultimately, Jane Hill's fall from trusted carer to convicted murderer demonstrates how greed, desperation, and fear of exposure can destroy lives. It is a haunting reminder that true safety begins with transparency, oversight, and courage to act when something feels wrong. Second offender, Corinna Smith, 56 years old. Cheshire, July 2020. A quiet home in Neston became the scene of an act so shocking it would grip headlines across the UK. Behind the door of a modest house, a long marriage ended in unimaginable violence. The woman at the center of the case was Corinna Smith, also known as Corinna Baines. At 59 years old, she had been married to Michael Baines for 38 years, since she was 21 and he was 42. Friends and neighbors described her as kind, loving, and without blemish on her record. She had never been in trouble with the law. In recent years, she had even become her husband's carer as his health declined. But beneath the surface, tensions were festering. On the 13th of July 2020, Smith was told by her daughter of devastating allegations, claims that her husband had sexually abused both her daughter and her son Craig, who had taken his own life in 2007. Those allegations, never tested in court, shattered Smith's world. Consumed by anger, confusion, and grief, she booked a polygraph test for her husband. By dawn the next day, her emotions had hardened into a plan for retribution. In the early hours of July 14, Smith filled a bucket with boiling water from 2 kettles and added 3 large bags of sugar. The mixture thickened into a viscous liquid designed to stick and burn. As her husband slept, she poured it across his arms and torso. The searing liquid clung to his skin. Michael Baines, then 81, woke to agony. Smith did not call an ambulance. Instead, she fled to a neighbor's house, where she banged on the door and confessed, "I've hurt him really bad. I think I've killed him." When police arrived, they found Mr. Baines whimpering in pain, his skin peeling away. He was rushed to Wiston Hospital, with burns covering more than a third of his body. Despite multiple operations, he succumbed to his injuries on August 18, 5 weeks later. Smith was arrested and charged, initially with grievous bodily harm, later upgraded to murder after her husband's death. At Chester Crown Court, in June 2021, she pleaded not guilty to murder but admitted manslaughter, claiming she did not intend to kill. Prosecutors rejected that plea. They argued the method, the preparation, and the sheer cruelty showed clear intent to cause at least very serious harm. The jury agreed and convicted her of murder. On the 9th of July 2021, Smith returned to the dock to hear her fate. She appeared weary, her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly as the judge addressed her. He acknowledged her previously blameless life and the emotional storm triggered by the allegations. Yet he called the attack particularly nasty, noting that the boiling sugar mixture made the burns far worse and highlighted the vulnerability of her elderly husband. The mandatory life sentence was imposed, with a minimum term of 12 years. The victim's children delivered dignified but heartbroken statements, describing terrible grief and shock. For them, justice brought no closure. The allegations against their father died with him, unresolved. This case left a haunting paradox: a woman with no history of violence transformed by anger and grief into a killer. It is a reminder that even in ordinary homes, hidden truths and unchecked emotions can ignite irreversible tragedy. Third offender, Marie Crook, 43 years old. St. Helens, October 2019. On a bright autumn morning, commuters expected an ordinary journey along the East Lancashire Road. Within minutes, it would become the site of a deliberate and devastating tragedy. Behind the wheel was Marie Crook, a 42-year-old mother of 2 from Cheviot Avenue in St. Helens. Described as a woman of positive good character who had worked all her life, Crook was known for her devotion to her family and her role in helping friends and neighbors. But on that morning, she drove in a manner that prosecutors later called deliberate, reckless, and selfish beyond comprehension. For 5 miles, she pushed her Renault Clio close to 100 miles per hour, weaving through traffic where the limit was just 40. Witnesses recalled her car moving with a determined manner, ignoring barriers, rules, and the lives of those around her. At the Moorgate Road junction, she crossed onto the wrong side of the carriageway. Instead of correcting course, she accelerated. Soon after, she entered the M57 slip road against oncoming traffic. An articulated lorry narrowly missed her. But seconds later, her vehicle collided head-on with a Honda Jazz driven by 4-year-old retired headteacher Paula Kingdon. The impact was catastrophic. Both women were trapped in the wreckage and had to be cut free by firefighters before being airlifted to Aintree Hospital. Crook survived, critically injured. Kingdon did not. After decades dedicated to teaching young children, her retirement and her future were taken in an instant. Police immediately launched an investigation. Crook claimed she had taken a wrong turn and panicked, insisting she had no memory of the events. Yet evidence mounted against her. Photographs on her phone showed motorway junctions and crash scenes with no explanation. Witnesses testified she appeared purposeful, not confused. Prosecutors argued the only reasonable conclusion was that Crook had intended to harm herself, indifferent to the lives she endangered. In August 2021, Crook pleaded guilty to causing death by dangerous driving. At Liverpool Crown Court that October, Judge David Aubrey QC rejected her account, saying, "This was a deliberate course of conduct, profoundly selfish, because you were prepared to injure or kill others in achieving your purpose." He emphasized the sheer gravity of her actions. It is difficult to think of a more serious case of dangerous driving. Crook was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison and banned from driving for 3 years after her release. In court, Crook sat pale and silent, her head bowed, offering no words of explanation. Her refusal to admit the deliberate nature of her actions left the victim's family in anguish. Paula's brother, Stephen Sharples, said their sister's chance to enjoy her later years was cruelly taken away by the senseless actions of this stranger. The family expressed deep distress that Crook's continued insistence on panic had denied them even the comfort of truth. Friends and former colleagues of Paula Kingdon raised funds in her memory, recalling her lifelong dedication to children and her community. Her death was felt not only by her family, but by generations of pupils and teachers who mourned a respected leader. This case underscores how a single moment of reckless determination can erase an entire life of service and kindness. It is a reminder that responsibility behind the wheel is never optional, and that one person's decision can alter countless futures forever. Fourth offender, Sarah Lewis, 32 years old. Wirral, May 2017. Behind the closed door of a modest flat, a stormy relationship spiraled into violence that ended with a man's life lost to a wound no one thought could kill. The perpetrator was Sarah Lewis, a 46-year-old woman from Croxteth Avenue in Seaforth. She had been described in court as a hard-working and capable woman who was not inherently bad, but perhaps emotionally inadequate. Her life seemed ordinary until she met Paul Lavelle, a 50-year-old father, through an online dating website. Their relationship quickly became volatile, fueled by heavy drinking and explosive arguments. Police had already been called on previous occasions. This time, however, the outcome was fatal. On the night of the 27th of May 2017, Lewis and Lavelle were drinking at his flat in Rock Ferry. What began as a drunken row escalated. In anger, Lewis hurled a dinner plate, shattering it against the wall. Grabbing a jagged shard, she thrust it into Lavelle's face. The wound, near his nostril, appeared small but severed an artery. As blood flowed, Lewis did not seek help. Instead, she took photographs of his injured face before leaving the flat to spend the night at her sister's home. Alone, Lavelle tried to cope. He left a chilling voicemail for a business contact. "This place is a bloodbath. I need to go to Arrow Park Hospital." He attempted to call Lewis 8 times, but she did not answer. Throughout the night, he bled slowly to death, collapsing in the bathroom by morning. When Lewis returned, she found his lifeless body slumped over the bath. She deleted his voicemail messages before police arrived. The investigation soon pointed to Lewis. Initially charged with murder, she denied intending to kill. Prosecutors argued that her actions were deliberate. She had broken the plate and chosen to use the shard as a weapon. On the second day of her trial at Liverpool Crown Court in January 2018, Lewis pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Judge David Aubrey QC told her, "You thrust the shard into his face. Neither you nor he sought medical attention or made any attempt to stem the flow of blood." He acknowledged the sad and unusual nature of the death, but stressed that Lewis bore full responsibility. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. In the dock, Lewis looked subdued, her face pale, as she whispered she was deeply, deeply sorry. The family of Paul Lavelle described their grief as more pain and heartbreak than I can put into words. His son said, "A piece of me is missing." For them, closure only came when Lewis admitted her guilt. Out of tragedy, they founded the Paul Lavelle Foundation, dedicated to helping men speak out about domestic abuse. The initiative gained traction on social media and received court-ordered funding, shining a light on a subject often left in silence. This case revealed the hidden consequences of unchecked violence within intimate relationships. A single act, born of anger and alcohol, destroyed 2 lives and reshaped many others. It is a reminder that silence can be as destructive as violence, and that confronting the truth is the only path to prevention. Fifth offender, Lyndsey McCool, 39 years old. Seacom, March 2017. In the quiet hours before dawn, a troubled woman's descent into chaos ended with a brutal killing that shocked a community and destroyed a family's world forever. The perpetrator was Lyndsey McCool, a 37-year-old from Birkenhead. Her life had been marked by dysfunction, abusive relationships, addiction to crack cocaine and heroin, homelessness, and a criminal record stretching back decades. With 56 convictions for 87 offenses, she was no stranger to prison. Released on license just 6 days before the crime, McCool returned to a world of drugs and desperation. Described by her own defense as a coward who had done something evil, she was a mother whose path had been shaped by abuse, trauma, and addiction. Her victim was Jeremy Dickinson, known to friends as Jem, a 57-year-old man described as kind, vulnerable, and generous. He often let people into his home for company, even when they took advantage of his openness. On the night of the 28th of March 2017, McCool was in his Seacombe home with another man. They drank, played music, and by the early morning, only McCool remained. Around 4 a.m. Neighbors heard a loud bang. Inside, McCool picked up a heavy dumbbell and struck Dickinson repeatedly in the head. The attack was frenzied, leaving catastrophic injuries. When his body was discovered, the dumbbell lay on his back, his head so disfigured that McCool later confessed to a friend, "I think I've killed him." His brain was hanging out the back of his head. Instead of calling for help, McCool rifled through his belongings and stole money from his wallet. Hours later, Dickinson's mother, Barbara Miller, entered his home and found his bloodied body at the bottom of the stairs. She later told the court, "He was my world. Finding him like that will stay with me forever." Cradling her son until emergency services arrived, she described how the trauma drove her into despair, leaving her health and spirit broken. McCool was arrested the following day. Under questioning, she admitted to the killing, offering little explanation beyond her state of drug-induced chaos. A psychiatric report detailed her long history of trauma, addiction, and failed rehabilitation, but the brutality of her actions left little room for mitigation. Prosecutors argued that the ferocity of the attack showed clear intent to kill. At Liverpool Crown Court in July 2017, McCool pleaded guilty to murder. She stood in the dock, weeping as she heard her fate. Life imprisonment with a minimum of 17.5 years. Judge David Aubrey QC told her she had committed an act of ferocity and brutality against a vulnerable man in his own home, and that her actions had caused devastation beyond words to his family. The case reverberated across Merseyside. For many, it underscored the dangers posed by repeat offenders, especially as McCool had been released from prison less than a week before she killed. For others, it was a stark reminder of how unchecked addiction can consume both the addict and those around them. In the end, one vulnerable man's kindness was betrayed by the very person he had welcomed into his home, and one mother's grief became a haunting symbol of the irreversible damage left by violence. Some wounds, inflicted in a moment of cruelty, never heal. Sixth offender, Farieissia Martin, 22 years old. Liverpool, November 2014. In a quiet street in Dingle, the end of a long and volatile relationship exploded into fatal violence, leaving a young father dead and a young mother behind bars. The offender was Farieissia Martin, known as Friday. At just 22 years old, she was a mother of 2 children, living in Toxteth with her childhood sweetheart, Kyle Farrell. Their relationship began in school and grew into a young family, but beneath the surface was years of coercive control, jealousy, and repeated abuse. Kyle was described by his family as a devoted father, but behind closed doors, the picture was far more complex. On the night of the 20th of November 2014, Martin went drinking with friends and returned home at 4:30 a.m. After consuming half a bottle of brandy, Kyle, 21, had stayed home with the children. When she arrived, the pair argued fiercely. Kyle accused her of infidelity, smashed her phone, and according to her account, grabbed her by the throat in the kitchen. In that moment, Martin reached for a kitchen knife and shouted at him to let go. What followed was one fatal thrust, a single stab wound piercing his chest and heart. Within minutes, Kyle collapsed, bleeding heavily. He was rushed to hospital but could not be saved. Martin initially phoned emergency services, claiming an intruder had attacked him, a lie she later admitted. Police found the knife in the property, and she was charged with murder. At trial in June 2015, prosecutors argued the stab wound was deliberate, describing it as a thrusting motion, consistent with intent. The jury convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 13 years. Kyle's family said their grief was immeasurable, describing him as a beloved son and condemning Martin's initial lies as selfish and damaging. But behind the conviction lay a darker truth. Martin's defense had failed to present crucial evidence of the abuse she suffered: physical assaults, coercive control, and even violence during pregnancy. Years later, psychiatric experts confirmed she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic amnesia at the time of the stabbing. Justice for Women, a campaign group, took up her case, arguing she had been wrongly convicted. In December 2020, the Court of Appeal quashed her murder conviction, acknowledging the failure to consider the impact of domestic abuse and PTSD. On the eve of a retrial in May 2021, prosecutors accepted her plea to manslaughter. The judge sentenced her to 10 years and 9 months, also adding a short term for possession of prohibited items in prison. By then, she had already served more than 6 years in custody. Public reaction was divided. Kyle's family felt betrayed, insisting he was a loving father whose life was cut short. But campaigners pointed to Martin's case, alongside the high-profile Sally Challen appeal, as a landmark in recognizing coercive control within homicide law. A BBC documentary, Bad Love, Why Did Free Kill Kyle?, amplified debate on how the justice system treats women who kill violent partners. When Martin stood in court for her final sentencing, she appeared subdued, far from the fiery image painted years before. Her case revealed not only a tragic killing, but also the hidden scars of coercive relationships that often remain unseen until it is too late. In the end, the story forces a painful question: when violence erupts in the home, where does accountability end and survival begin? Seventh offender: Maureen Smith, 43 years old, and Kelly Smith, 40 years old. Liverpool, February 2012. A violent robbery in Norris Green ended in the brutal death of a young father, exposing the destructive consequences of jealousy, greed, and a controversial legal principle that still sparks debate today. The offenders were Maureen Smith, 43, and her younger sister Kelly, 40. Both lived in Toxteth, Liverpool, and had been considered women of good character before this case. Maureen had once shared her life with the victim, David Corridon, raising 2 children with him during their 13-year relationship. But after their separation, resentment festered. Obsessed with suspicions about his other relationships and aware of rumors that he kept tens of thousands of pounds hidden in his home, Maureen devised a plan. With Kelly's help, she sought out local criminals to steal the money, a decision that would set in motion a chain of events neither sister could control. On the 27th of February 2012, just after 4 p.m., 3 men forced their way into David's house in Norris Green. Armed with knives and screwdrivers, they demanded cash. David, a 32-year-old father described as well-built and combative, fought back. What followed was a frenzied assault. He was stabbed 6 times, dragged upstairs, and left fatally injured. Despite the brutality, the robbers left with little more than £900 and some watches. Within hours, Kelly phoned the intermediary, Tyrone Griffiths, screaming that David was dead. The police investigation quickly connected the threads. Phone records, witness accounts, and forensic evidence revealed the sisters' role in orchestrating the robbery. They were not present at the scene, but prosecutors argued under the doctrine of joint enterprise that they foresaw the likelihood of violence when recruiting armed criminals for the job. Both sisters were charged with murder. At Liverpool Crown Court in January 2013, the trial laid bare the planning behind the attack. The jury heard of failed earlier burglary attempts and the sisters' determination to recover what they believed to be £40,000. The judge accepted that Maureen never wanted David to die, but emphasized that she bore heavy responsibility, both legal and moral, for setting the plan in motion. Both women were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with Maureen ordered to serve a minimum of 23 years and Kelly 22. David's family sat in court throughout, describing themselves as shocked, appalled, and devastated by the killing. They spoke of a devoted son and father whose life was needlessly stolen. To them, justice was served. But outside the courtroom, controversy brewed. Campaigners against joint enterprise laws argued that Maureen and Kelly never intended murder, pointing to their lack of presence at the scene. Their father, Kevin, launched appeals, insisting the law was unfairly applied. The Court of Appeal in 2018 upheld the convictions, ruling the sisters must have foreseen serious violence would be used. The case entered public debate, highlighted in the BBC drama Common, and even prompted Liverpool MP Kim Johnson to introduce a bill seeking reform of joint enterprise laws. For some, the sisters remain cautionary examples of misplaced loyalty and reckless decisions. For others, they are symbols of injustice, women serving life sentences for a killing they did not physically commit. As Maureen and Kelly Smith continue their long sentences, the case endures as a reminder that choices made in anger and desperation can spiral into irreversible tragedy, leaving behind grief, division, and unanswered questions about justice itself. 8th offender, Deborah Andrews, 44 years old. Skelmersdale, July 2018. A night of drinking and drugs among friends spiraled into one of Merseyside's most savage killings, leaving a vulnerable man dead and his killers unrepentant. Deborah Andrews, aged 44, lived on Elmstead in Skelmersdale. She had no serious criminal history, was described as a woman of limited intelligence, and until then, carried the image of someone with a previously good character. But that facade collapsed alongside her co-defendant, William Vale, when the two turned on their friend, Eamon Brady. Brady, also 44, had long been considered vulnerable. He often welcomed people into his home for companionship, a generosity that was repeatedly exploited. On this occasion, it cost him his life. On July 20, the three gathered in Brady's flat, drinking and smoking cannabis late into the night. By the early hours of July 21, tensions boiled over. What followed was described in court as a vicious and prolonged attack. Andrews and Vale unleashed violence with multiple weapons, a hammer, knives, scissors, and a screwdriver. Brady was struck with the hammer at least 17 times, stabbed, and left with catastrophic head and neck injuries. It was not a momentary outburst, but a sustained assault marked by cruelty and determination. Afterwards, the pair dragged his body, wrapped it in bedding, and set it alight. Fire crews arrived at 7:30 a.m., battling flames that risked the lives of other residents. The body was barely recognizable. In the hours that followed, Andrews and Vale went to Beacon Country Park to burn their clothing and hide weapons. Reports revealed that they had sex in the park not long after, behavior the judge would later describe as callous beyond comprehension. They then attempted to profit, stealing a PlayStation, sound system, and even a bank card from Brady's flat. Detectives quickly pieced the case together. Fire investigators ruled the blaze deliberate, and forensic teams recovered evidence of the brutal attack. When Andrews was arrested, chilling recordings captured her, buzzing with excitement, comparing herself and Vale to the new Bonnie and Clyde. Such words painted a disturbing picture of her mindset, not one of regret, but of twisted pride. At Preston Crown Court in 2019, both Andrews and Vale were convicted of murder. Andrews sat emotionless in the dock, her hands stuffed in her pockets as the details of the attack were read aloud. The judge imposed a life sentence with a minimum of 28 years, citing the extraordinary brutality, the vulnerability of the victim, and the reckless act of setting the body ablaze in a residential block. For Brady's daughter Amy, the sentence brought some measure of justice, but no relief from the trauma. She called her father her best friend and described nightmares from seeing the state of his battered, burned body. Speaking outside court, she said, "They are two very dangerous monsters, and I am pleased they are off the streets." This case drew local attention not only for its violence but also for its chilling aftermath. Vale had posted online just days before, writing, "The question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me." That arrogance was matched by Andrews' warped sense of identity as part of a criminal duo. The story of Deborah Andrews stands as a grim reminder that behind ordinary facades, brutality can erupt without warning, leaving devastation in its wake and questions about how cruelty can coexist with humanity. Final offender, Amanda McDonnell, 43 years old. Bootle, November 2023. A volatile relationship fueled by alcohol reached its breaking point, ending with a single stab wound that would take a life and leave a family devastated. The perpetrator was Amanda McDonnell, aged 43, a woman with no fixed address at the time of her sentencing. She was the partner of Gerard Hand, also 44, and their relationship was defined by constant turbulence and mutual dependence on alcohol. McDonnell's history told of a downward spiral after her mother's death, mental health struggles, violent outbursts, often linked to drink, and previous convictions involving weapons. Despite her troubled background, she had shown signs of remorse and even helped other prisoners while in custody, but none of that erased what happened on that November morning. The events began the day before, when McDonnell and Hand had been drinking heavily. In the early hours of November 22, after a visit to a petrol station for more alcohol, they climbed into a friend's ground-floor flat on Church Walk in Bootle. There, an argument ignited, fueled by jealousy and intoxication. Witnesses later heard that Gerard assaulted McDonnell, punching her nose, biting her fingers, and going for her throat. In fear, she retreated into the kitchen and armed herself with a knife. When Gerard allegedly lunged toward her, she claimed he walked into the knife. The wound, delivered under his left armpit, proved fatal. At first, McDonnell attempted deception. She told emergency services an intruder had broken in, at one point blaming a man connected to Gerard's alleged debts. But as the evidence closed in, the truth surfaced. Gerard was airlifted to Aintree Hospital, but died at 10:45 a.m. His family described him as a gentle giant and a larger-than-life character whose absence left an aching void. The investigation quickly revealed the chaotic and destructive nature of the couple's life together. Police noted both had histories of violence, much of it tied to alcohol. McDonnell's defense leaned on excessive self-defense, pointing to the violence she endured that night and her longer history of abuse in relationships. Judge Neil Flewitt, KC, accepted the act was not premeditated but carried out in the heat of the moment. At Liverpool Crown Court, in June 2024, McDonnell pleaded guilty to manslaughter, sparing the family the pain of a murder trial. She was sentenced to 8.5 years, with eligibility for release after serving 2/3. Sitting in the dock, she showed visible remorse, a stark contrast to the chaotic and violent persona she had once embodied. For Gerard's family, the pain was profound. His mother described crying every night, unable to listen to music or visit familiar places without grief overwhelming her. Yet, there was a sense of solace in knowing the guilty plea meant they did not have to hear the darkest details of his final moments repeated in court. Cases like this highlight 3 chilling truths. Alcohol-fueled relationships can become lethal without warning, ignoring violent patterns in a partner can be fatal, and deception, after tragedy, only deepens the pain of those left behind. The story of Amanda McDonnell stands as a sobering reminder of how fragile the line between love and destruction can be, and how one night can alter countless lives forever. The stories you've just heard reveal a chilling truth. Behind ordinary streets and familiar faces in Merseyside, betrayal, obsession, and violence can erupt without warning. From carers who crossed the line of trust to partners whose love turned lethal, each case is a reminder that danger often hides in plain sight. These women's crimes left families shattered, communities stunned, and raised questions that will echo for years to come. But this is only one chapter in the long, unsettling history of UK true crime. If you don't want to miss the next story, one darker and more disturbing than the last, make sure to subscribe to UK Real Crime and tap the bell icon. That way, you'll be the first to uncover the secrets, the trials, and the sentences that shaped Britain's most shocking cases.